Okay, excellent. Hello then, and welcome to Evaluating Money, Value for Money in Evaluation. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's fantastic to see such a strong turnout. Clearly, this is a topic that's resonating at the moment. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we are dialing in today. While we may be in different places, we are on lands that have been cared for by Indigenous people for many years. Certainly here in Australia, that's been for tens of thousands of years. For me, and I'm at home this afternoon, this is the lands of the Dharawal and Griargal peoples. But I'd like to pay my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and to their elders past and present. So for those of you who don't know me, we might switch to the next slide, Alex. I am the State Director for New South Wales at Verian, Australia. My main remit is servicing the New South Wales Government, but I also have not-for-profit clients and lean into projects that Verian runs across the country that align with my areas of specialism. I am a career social researcher and a research evaluation dualist. Today, I have the very great pleasure of being in conversation with two of my esteemed colleagues. The first is Elizabeth Betts. Elizabeth is a relatively new face at Verian Australia and is an Associate Director in Evaluation. Elizabeth has come to us from one of the large consultancies, and prior to that was in academia at a number of Australian universities. Besides being an evaluator and researcher, Elizabeth is also an anthropologist and sociologist with a deep passion for social policy. The second, and we will be hearing from him very shortly, is Alex Hurrell, who has gotten up extra early to be here today. Alex leads the evaluation suppliers Am I
Yeah.
back? That was horrible. I just completely quit out of Zoom. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, okay. I'll keep going. I have no idea what happened there. What was I saying? Yes, I was talking
Mhm.
about the UK evaluation team. The team covers almost all policy areas with particular expertise in housing, education, children's social care, crime and justice, net zero, transport, and infrastructure. Alex is a trained economist, and his journey as an evaluator began with randomised control trials and quasi-experimental impact analysis. But over the years, he's broadened out, bringing extensive expertise in monitoring, evaluation and learning, or MEL systems, theory-based evaluation, and value for money. His evaluation experience spans both the UK and international contexts. So, why are we here today? Well, the inspiration behind this webinar, and it really came about as we started to approach budget season here in Australia, is us recognising the increasing pressure across governments and across sectors to justify spending and demonstrate impact. When we talk about value for money, we are really asking a simple question. Is the impact of this program worth the resources that went into it? Sounds simple, but not every evaluator is an economist, and not every economist is equipped to assess value for money in a practical, evaluative context. In the UK, this has been a major focus. The Treasury there has something called the Magenta Book, which provides detailed guidance on evaluation design, causal inference, and the rigorous assessment of effectiveness, efficiency, and economy in public spending. At Verian, we see real value in bringing these disciplines together. A more holistic, cross-disciplinary approach is key, and that's reflected in a guide co-created by my colleague Alex, which draws on these principles but translates them into applied evaluation practice. So we've invited Alex to take us through what evaluating value for money in public services looks like currently in the UK. And then we will be drawing Elizabeth in too to talk through how approaches grounded in frameworks like the Magenta Book can inform and strengthen value for money assessments here in Australia. So let's just move on to the next slide now. We just have some information here to help anyone interested to use translations or captions as part of the webinar. We would also love to take questions and your own comments today. So if anything occurs to you, please feel free to use just the standard Zoom chat function. Fire away and I'll keep an eye on this and we'll see how many questions we can get through. So now I'll hand over to you, Alex, to talk us through value for money evaluations in the UK.
Great. Thanks very much, Bettina. Yeah, so Bettina and Elizabeth asked me to give an overview of value for money evaluation, specifically from a UK perspective. So we can start off by looking at how the UK government define value for money. So the UK Treasury has something called the Green Book. That's the guidance on economic evaluation or economic appraisal. And under this definition, value for money is defined as a balanced judgment about optimal use of public resources to achieve the objectives of a proposal. So it's a really interesting emphasis there on balanced judgment, right? And there are a number of considerations that need to be taken into account. So as per the definition, we need to think about the performance of the proposal against its objectives and what were the success factors. Perhaps the one that's sort of most recognized and kind of accepted, or sort of the one that people latch onto, and is this one, which is that the costs and benefits to society that are monetizable, and by that we mean the costs and benefits where we can attach a pound or a dollar value to. So we need to take those into account. We can compare them. I'll come on to that later. And that's really been a dominant strand of value for money evaluation in the UK. But there are other considerations. So others include the fact that we must also take into account costs and benefits which aren't so readily monetizable. Yeah, so those are ones that it's not so easy to attach a dollar or pound value to. We also need to think about public sector financial impact. So there might be an intervention that has downstream impacts on public service use in other areas, and therefore there might be a saving to government spending down the line, or even in other cases an increase on that, and that needs to be taken into account as well. We should also think about distribution and how costs and benefits vary across different social groups and across different places as relevant. And finally, we need to think about the risks and uncertainty inherent in any intervention as part of that value for money assessment. So that's how value for money is defined in the UK. There is a growing acceptance that the UK needs more value for money evaluation. So why is that? Well, in the UK, we've got something called the Evaluation Task Force. This is a unit that was set up some years ago that sits jointly between what we call the Cabinet Office, it's right at the centre of government, and the Treasury. So it reports into both of those organisations, and its mandate is to push for more and better evaluation across government. Last year, the task force set up what's called the Evaluation Registry, and this is a great initiative whereby all commissioners of evaluations now need to evaluations they commission put in at a minimum information that valuation, but they can also publish the resource, and it's publicly available, so useful.
Alex, you're just breaking up slightly or very badly. Let's just pause and see.
When we look at when we can see that these different evaluations were tagged. So we had, sorry.
No. Yeah, can you just go back approximately 20 seconds? You started cutting out all of a sudden. The joys of technology. It sometimes works and other times not, and now we've completely lost Alex, I think.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oops, we can hear you, Alex. I think the same thing happened to you that happened to me.
Okay.
You've just quit out. Do you want to try and share your screen again? We've lost about 20 seconds worth of content.
Okay.
We'll all just keep calm and keep smiling.
Is the slide back on?
It's starting to come back on. Meanwhile, if anyone's got questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Okay, we've got you back, Alex. Fingers crossed.
Okay. So I think I'd introduced the idea, idea of the evaluation registry. So as of last year, when it launched, there was a lot of evaluations that were tagged as impact evaluations. There were around 700 or so tagged as process evaluations, but you can see here on the chart that there were only 200 or so value for money evaluations out of that 1,600. So relatively very few value for money evaluations. That was last year. The situation is improving. So if you look at evaluations that were complete in the last 10 years, about 15% have value for money analysis as part of them. If you look at ongoing evaluations, that's rises to 40%. And looking forward, across all planned UK government evaluations, that's up at 60%. So it's definitely an upward trend, but there's still room for lots of improvement. And if you look at the evaluation registry today, you'll find around 454 VFM evaluations. So that's great. That's nearly double what was there last year. So there's been more evaluations added in there, and more of them have VFM components to them. But those evaluations broadly span the last 10 years. And over that time, the UK government spent £10 trillion, more or less. So by my maths, that works out at about one VFM evaluation for every £22 billion of UK government spending. So I think that illustrates the gap and why there's still room for improvement. There is a particular problem for major projects. So in the UK, we've got something called the Government Major Projects Portfolio, or GMPP. And currently this comprises 227 projects, which relate to the really big, high spending, big ticket programs, infrastructure, defense, IT transformation, these type of things. And combined, they have a value of £834 billion currently. So clearly that represents a huge share of government spending. And when we look at the evaluation task force did a review last year and looked at the evaluation plans for these major projects. Only 31% of those projects had a robust impact evaluation plan. 28% had robust process evaluation plans, but only 17% had robust value for money evaluation plans. So although the situation is improving and there are more VFM evaluations being commissioned and implemented, there's still room for improvement, and there's a particular gap in these very large major programs where there's a huge amount of spend, and arguably VFM evaluation and focus is almost most important. Another development this year in the world of UK evaluation is that new guidance came out. So we have, I think, as Bettina said, something called the Magenta Book. This is central government guidance on evaluations, came out in May, and it set the evaluation world in the UK alight with excitement. And this contained lots of updates, but the ones I'll focus on here are the ones that related to value for money evaluation. So the updates here on VFM focused on a clearer definition, so a different definition in line with the one I mentioned above around this balanced judgment, and key principles. But it also outlined more detail on methods going beyond traditional cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis, where the focus had been previously. As I mentioned before, the VFM was defined more explicitly as a judgment on the best use of public resources, and that needed to take into account, or needs to take into account, both the monetizable costs and benefits, which we can assess using our cost benefit analysis approaches, but also non-monetizable social benefits and costs, where it was less clear previously how those should be taken into account in that balanced judgment. There's also a key principle around embedding VFM plans from the outside and linking those plans with the economic appraisal that takes place as part of the business case when we justify excuse me, I just need, it's a slight childcare moment. Just give me one. Yeah, it's before the school day here in the UK, so kids are running around. I hope. So sorry, I'll repeat that again. There were another key principle is that we should embed VFM plans from the outside, from the outset. So defining what VFM performance looks like and linking that with the economic appraisal that will take place as part of the business case that justifies the investment in a government program. The guidance, there's a technical annex. It's a great read for those evaluation geeks out there, which goes into a bit more detail about methods in the different areas of evaluation. And in the VFM section, there are a number of different methods outlined. So we've got methods that quantify and convert costs and benefits into monetary units, and that's our traditional economic approaches. So cost benefit analysis is there, and that was there previously, but there's also more detail on social return on investment. There's methods which compare options based on costs relative to outcomes achieved. Those can be assessed using what's called cost effectiveness analysis. Again, that was there previously, but there's also more detail on cost utility analysis. But there are some new areas. There's more a new approach or approach that wasn't there previously is the 4Es framework. So this is a framework that was developed by the UK's National Audit Office. And this is a framework that sets out how you can assess value for money against economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity to come up with a more rounded, comprehensive assessment of value for money. And finally, there is detail about using rubrics-based approaches to assess value for money. And that includes what we call the value for investment approach. There's also, this is in the Magenta Book guidance, this is also referred to as the OPM King approach, but they're essentially the same. So at Verian in the UK, and hopefully, well, I know in other regions, we're also using what I just mentioned, this value for investment approach, the VFI approach. We published a guide a couple of years ago that was co-authored by myself, and Julian King, who I'm pretty sure is here in the audience today. And we are the guide we set out for value for money investment. I'll talk about in a minute what it brings, but it centers on the value for investment approach that Julian King is the chief architect of. It's also We're also increasingly applying it because I'll come on to the benefits on the next slide, but we're also increasingly applying it because it's being explicitly requested by our clients because it relates to some of the issues in the Magenta book and the challenges they face. So, for example, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, in its latest evaluation strategy, explicitly sets out a target for using value for investment in a minimum number of evaluations commissioned over the forthcoming period. Similarly, in other requests from government departments, we're seeing value for investment suggested as the proposed VFM approach, where it makes sense to do so. So we're increasingly applying it, and our clients are increasingly asking for it. Why is that? Well, what value for investment brings is firstly if explicit evaluative reasoning to answer these value for money questions, and we do that with that's the rubrics element that provides really clear answers to our value for money performance questions, which we find that the clients really value very much, particularly with the value for money evaluation questions. The senior policymakers or politicians, they want to know, okay, so what? Was that good value for money? Was that poor value for money? Should we spend more? Should we spend less? Should we shut the program or not? They want quite clear, decisive judgments, and that's quite hard in general. But rubrics are a really great. Our view is that rubrics are a really great way of structuring that challenge to make those really sharp judgments and provide those clear answers. VFI also enables systematic assessments against the 4Es. So I mentioned the 4Es framework, which is now in the Magenta book that was developed by the National Audit Office. And by the benefit there is really, in my view, the chief benefit is really that we can, by breaking down the assessment into these different dimensions, economy, efficiency, effectiveness, equity, we can learn how to maximize VFM because we can see how economy can be improved, we can see how efficiency can be improved, and we can see how effectiveness can be improved, and that in turn can drive adaptive management to increase value for money. Not just that, but we can also use VFI as a kind of wrapper to combine a 4Es approach with cost benefit analysis, and then we get the best of all worlds. So we can get our very powerful cost benefit analysis. Here were the costs, here were the benefits. At the end of the day, did the costs outweigh the benefits? But we can then use the VFI to say, and was that sufficient? Was that good? Was that good enough? And that goes beyond the snapshot assessment. We've got the 4Es nuance, which tells us how VFM could be improved, and we get something a lot more rounded and insightful. And finally, VFI can facilitate ongoing VFM assessments. So we're looking throughout the policy cycle, throughout implementation, not just traditionally CBA would come quite near the end. We'd need all the impact evaluation results to plug into our CBA model. It would come right at the end, often way too late, way past any key decision-making points. But by breaking it down and by looking at across the cycle and thinking in advance, we can facilitate VFM assessment as we go along, and that in turn can inform adaptive management and drive better performance. So that's me done, Bettina. Shall I stop sharing? Because I don't think we need the slides now.
Yes, perfect.
Apologies for the small interruption.
Fingers crossed we don't have any more. I feel almost worried about calling upon Julian, but we're so pleased to have Julian King in the flesh on the call today. Can I see you, Julian?
I can see you.
Yes,
can you see me?
Amazing. We're so pleased to have you on the call. I might start off our discussion with a question for you, if I may. Yeah, we're just interested in your perspective on how you see value for investment applying to the Australian context.
Okay, well, look, first, thanks for a great presentation and thanks for throwing me the first question. The value for investment approach was actually developed in Australia at the University of Melbourne through my PhD. And it's being used in Australia now to evaluate policies and programs at both federal and state level. So some examples that spring to mind include in aged care, education, environment and sustainability, family violence prevention, mental health, some DFAT work, and ILSC, the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation's performance framework. So that just to give you a few examples. And of course, the potential is much, much bigger to move from program level and organization use to more systemic whole of government adoption. And the UK, as Alex just shared, is leading the way on that. But I'd love to see that happen in Australia too, of course. Now, there's a couple of pathways on offer to help people pick it up for anyone who's interested. And one is I run a professional development workshop through the Australian Evaluation Society. VFI is also included in the online Master of Evaluation course at the University of Melbourne. And you'll find some free resources on my website. That's julianking.co.nz, including some examples of Verian UK projects and some open access guides that Alex and I contributed to, including the one that Alex put up just before on the screen. And of course, we're all consultants on this panel, so we're available to help. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Bettina.
Thanks so much, Julian. And if anyone has extra questions for Julian, pop them in the chat. Okay, Elizabeth has been waiting very patiently. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I guess Alex's slides also covered the Magenta book. So taking a bit of a step back, Elizabeth, can you talk us through how useful you think the Magenta book is for us Australians? You know, how can the Magenta book help value for money assessments here?
Thanks, Bettina, and thanks for having me today as well. I personally think that the Magenta book is highly relevant to the Australian context, as it really closely aligns with the broader push from Treasury towards evidence-informed decision-making and better use of public resources, which, as you mentioned earlier, is particularly important when budgets are tight, and they are tight at the moment, and especially where I am based in Victoria, as we all know. So I'm not saying that there are no resources available in Australia. We have great resources here as well from the Australian Centre for Evaluation, as well from state-based agencies. However, they tend to be focused more on selecting fit-for-purpose evaluation approaches as a more bit of a high-level guidance for practitioners. Whereas the Magenta book kind of complements these resources, as Alex described, is a bit more of a technical reference point that helps give some guidance on evaluation theory. So when it comes to evaluation for money, for value for money assessments, as Alex also mentioned, the recent update in the Magenta book really provides detailed and mature guidance that I don't believe is available in Australia as such in other resources. At least I haven't come across it to that extent. So I think it's a great resource to draw on for us to combine with what we already have available. As also noted, a key strength really is that it recognizes that there are different approaches that can be taken, and explains when and how, and gives some guidance around what the best move forward is, essentially.
Yeah, fantastic. And Elizabeth, what do you personally see as the biggest challenges with value for money assessments? Why do we need this sort of advice?
Well, Alex already called out a few challenges in his slides. So I think fundamentally, it's it's growing, that value for money assessments go beyond just an exercise of like a technical exercise to they also involve judgment and trade-offs, and they shouldn't be forgotten. And I think the key challenge in that respect is really defining what value actually means. And it can mean different things for different people. So upfront, I think it's really clear, it needs to be clear how different stakeholders define and prioritize value. And so I think it's important to determine if it's cost, or if it's impact, or if it's equity, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So essentially, I think a co-design approach for this to define clear criteria is important. And if that doesn't happen, that can create a challenge. But also, as Alex flagged, data availability, quality is another challenge, or just comparing initiatives that operate in different contexts or are at different stages or different maturity levels, like often the case in pilot projects, for example, have varying levels of data quality. All that can lead to simplistic or misleading assessments, and that is really a challenge in terms of what it means for the investments moving forward. Personally, however, and that's probably where my background as anthropologist and sociologist comes out. I find most challenging if value for money is limited to a monetary or a dollar amount, or a pound amount, as Alex called it, especially in complex social environments, or like social policy environments where there is potentially more that need to be considered. I think it was good to hear from Julian as well that he raised the example of domestic and family violence. I personally have done a few evaluations in this space, and yes, while economic benefits such as reduced justice, health, and crisis service costs can, sometimes be estimated, the most important outcome for domestic and family violence initiatives tend to really relate to safety, well-being, and social participation. But the value of someone living free from violence is difficult to express through monetary proxy, even though that is often central to, or the central objectives of any kind of intervention. So similarly, it is difficult to monetize trust in public services, but we do know that early interventions is likely to help lead to better outcome in the long term. So how do we measure that? That, people actually have trust in the systems, access them for early, engage in early intervention, which obviously in the long term is most likely to save a lot of money. So I think these examples really show that outcomes can create substantial public value, but that can't really easily necessarily be assessed through monetary items alone.
Yeah, fantastic. And Alex, do you have any further comments on the challenges?
Yeah, so well, everything, in addition to everything Elizabeth outlined, I think there's a key overarching challenge around that VFM performance judgment. So going from the kind of this is what happened, the facts, to so what? Okay, so why should I care if I'm a policymaker? Is that good? Is that bad? What do I do with that? And so, for example, if you've got the cost benefit analysis delivers the key metric is something called the cost benefit ratio. So that's like if you've got a cost benefit ratio of 2, that means the benefits in pound terms or dollar terms were twice as much as the costs that you put into this intervention. Is 2 good? Is it good enough? Could it be better? So what do I do with that compared to what? On what basis is that good, right? So I think that's a really key challenge in terms of taking technical analysis and turning it into policy making. And that's really where the rubrics approach is outlined in the Magenta book and inherent in the VFI approach come in, because they don't give the full answer, but they provide a really great framework for helping us guide us through that challenge. Another more practical challenge is around timing. So often there are lags in VFM evidence. So reports come too late in the decision process. I think I mentioned this earlier. So you need your impact analysis to go into your CBA analysis. You've maybe got to do data collection. All of that means that comes with lags. And by the time you've got your answer, your brilliant technical answer, the world's moved on, policies moved on, decisions were made, and that insight didn't arrive at the moment when it was needed for decisions. So that's where breaking it down into the 4 E's helps, because we can break it down. You might not be able to look at effectiveness and CBA right all the way through, but you can look at economy, you can look at procurement systems, you can look at delivery efficiency as you're going along, and all of that will help improve VFM as you're going.
Yeah, nice. And Alex, I was also going to ask you a bit more about the Magenta book refresh. I understand it's been fairly extensive, not just a light update. What do you think these changes signal for the future of value for money evaluation?
Thanks. Great question. Before I launch into it, I've noticed that there's someone called James Collis on the call, who's actually from the UK Cabinet Office, and he was involved personally in the Magenta Book update. So we might want to draw him in at some point for a question. And I should also acknowledge that some of the stats from the various ETF studies were I was directed to by him. So just acknowledging James. Thanks, James. And we'll bring you in a minute. So in terms of what does it signal? I think, I mean, obviously there's lots of changes, but focusing on the VFM ones, I think there's more emphasis on it reflects the gap I mentioned around a lack of VFM. There's a big emphasis on VFM evaluation. So I don't think that's going to go away, right? I think there's an expectation now that all evaluations of large scale significant programs must really have some VFM evaluation. It should be tailored as appropriate to the needs of that program. I think the other key thing that's really interesting, it sounds a bit technical, but it's this explicit assessment of, it's like this, we sometimes call it this thread, the golden thread between the ex ante or in advance assessment and what you think is going to happen. You do all this, you do quite a lot of analysis, often in the business case, doing your estimating what you think your benefits are going to be, what you think your costs are going to be, and on that basis you justify the decision, the investment decision. Well, it sounds crazy, but it's not always the case that when you're doing your final VFM analysis, you actually look back in detail and see which assumptions held, which assumptions didn't hold, which costs were higher, which costs were lower. And there's a load of insight there, as you can imagine, to test whether assumptions held or not, in terms of not just getting to the right answer, but then the next time you're doing your cost appraisal, you can hopefully be a bit better at making those assumptions. And I think the final thing, which we've touched on a lot already, Elizabeth talked about as well, is this broader consideration of value for money. So going beyond CBA and what's monetizable and having this broader sense. And I think that is a key departure. And I think that will be reflected in the way VFM is delivered. VFM evaluations are designed to deliver going forward.
Yeah, okay. And Alex, in your slides, you put forward a whole range of methods for evaluating value for money. And I see we've got a few questions coming through sort of in relation to this. The value for investment approach was just one of these. What would you say are the key strengths and weaknesses of some of these other approaches?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, but I'll just sort of focus on some high level ones. So I think with CBA, so cost benefit analysis and social return on investment, a key challenge is that many, in line with what Elizabeth outlined, many of the most important benefits of certain policies are really hard to measure, or they're really hard to monetize. So if either of those things hold, you've got a problem. Having said that, when it works and when it's appropriate, it is extremely powerful. You get an extremely powerful summary measure of that kind of overarching, what went in, what came out, how do they compare? And and I would say in combination with other evidence, that's extremely important piece of evidence that's going to hold a lot of weight when you make your value for money judgment. In terms of cost effectiveness analysis, cost utility analysis, that requires robust impact measurement and reliable cost data. The same applies for CBA actually, but here, it hinges on those measures of impact change, outcome change, and the cost of those. So that's a real that can be a challenge sometimes, yeah. But when you've got that, it can be really useful for comparing alternative options that are trying to target the same. So there might be very different ways that are targeting the same outcome, and you can imagine how powerful and useful that is when you can say, well, actually, it's half the price for every vaccine or for every child supported. It's half the price, okay? And if all things equal, that feels like a bit of a no-brainer that we'll go for the cheaper one, right? The third sort of bucket of methods outlined in the new Magenta book are around the 4Es, the 4Es framework. So I mentioned this already. I think what that really helps with is it opens up what you might think of as the black box, in the same way an implementational process evaluation sort of can open up the black box for an RCT. Yeah, you can really get inside and at the mechanisms of how an intervention is delivering the value and the impact by breaking it down. So we can look at we can unpack VFM performance. But I guess the weakness there is that on its own, it doesn't necessarily provide this overall value for money assessment. So that's why in combination, I think it's really powerful. And then the final bucket of approaches in the Magenta book is around these rubrics-based approaches. The benefit there, as I mentioned, is these clear evaluative judgments based on predefining what good looks like and doing that in a shared way in advance. But I would say a key challenge is that requires for that to be valid and carry weight going all the way through. It needs buy-in right at the start. You need the right people supporting that definition or driving that definition of what good looks like, and you need to front load much of that effort and hard thinking at the beginning. Often you'll do your analysis, you'll do it, and then you only at the end, when you're doing your analysis and synthesis, start thinking, okay, what does that mean? Is that good? Is that not? Under a rubrics-based approach, you're front loading all that, and you're trying to do that thinking in advance, and that can be a challenge. Yeah, there's loads more I could say, but I think that gives an overview.
Yeah, fantastic. And you just mentioned before, Alex, some of the data requirements for some of the things like a CBA. In practice, I know that a lot of my clients haven't necessarily thought about evaluation at the point of setting up their programs. We're not all evaluators. So evaluation isn't always embedded up front. The program data we end up having to work with can be patchy. So I'm interested, what sort of data is required for value for money evaluation? And what can evaluators realistically do if that data just isn't there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if part of this goes to this key principle that's emphasized in the Magenta book about being explicit about testing the economic appraisal assumption. So if you know you're going to have to do it, the obvious next step is to think about what data you're going to need to be able to test it and set it so it is set up from the outset. Now, I think that is still an aspiration. I'm very familiar with the challenges you outline in terms of evaluation coming in, sort of catching up and data not already being in place. But I think it's definitely the right aspiration to try or target to try and think about this well in advance and set up your data collection and monitoring systems to ensure you've got everything you need. I mean, more specifically, I think you'll always require for any sort of insightful value for money assessment, you really need reliable cost data, because otherwise what's the money? What are you actually assessing? What did it cost? And you'll know as well as I do that some programs that is actually quite hard to just the basic question of what did it cost. If it was one program out of many, or depending on how the accounting systems work, it can get quite messy. But generally, you've got some info on total spend. Yeah, generally speaking. So at a big level, overarching program, and you'd hope that was the case for public programs. You'd hope that the government had a handle at least on the overarching cost of a program, even if you can't necessarily break that down. So that's always required, I would say, reliable cost data. Ideally, you would have data that can enable robust impact evaluation. And so that's sort of either management information or survey data related to the key outcomes. And for the impact evaluation, that might mean that you've got that both for people in the program and for people who aren't in the program. So you can do some robust comparison using statistical techniques to come up with those impact figures. But that requires, that is often a data challenge. Yeah. But you also not only that, but you need to also have the evidence base to then apply monetary values to those outcomes to plug into your CBA. And again, that might be a gap in some areas. And there might be some outcomes which, I mean, generally speaking, there's quite a lot of, this is a very developed field, and there's lots of work around sort of value banks and people, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You can look at an outcome and you can find from another study what a reliable value that was attached to that. You also need, in terms of if you're going to break down the black box, as I refer to it, your process evaluation data needs to be there. You want to understand what was delivered, where, how, and complemented with good qualitative information around that to assess whether efficiency really was as good as it could have been, and if it wasn't, how not. There is, if you don't have that quant impact data, the data you need for quant impact analysis, then you can combine theory-based impact evaluation with CBA. So that's a sort of fallback there. And if you've got no impact evaluation at all, either for time or data reasons, you can still just assess the 3 E's, so economy, efficiency, and equity to an extent. And we've done that in a recent Verian example in the UK. And VFI actually can provide a flexible framework across all these different cases. So whatever your data availability picture, it's an approach that can provide a structure around that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. Another question for the panel. So how would you go about assessing value for money in highly innovative or experimental programs? Maybe if a program is testing something new and outcomes are uncertain, what does good value for money look like in those sorts of contexts?
I might jump in there to kick it off, but I actually think that's a quite interesting question, because in Australia, governments are obviously increasingly using pilot and innovative programs to tackle complex policy problems or test new approaches before they commit large amounts of money into them. So this growing focus is also reflected in the Australian National Audit Office, which did a review on pilot evaluations not that long ago, I think a couple of years ago, and that really highlighted the importance of robust evidence to inform decisions about whether initiatives should be scaled or should be modified or potentially even seized. And that kind of speaks also back to some of the questions in the chat before. I think someone asked if there's how does the Magenta book differ from the resources from the Centre for Australian Centre for Evaluation? Well, I'm just going to throw that in here. They complement each other. So it's not saying that, you either use one or the other. They extend on each other. So in this context, for example, as a response of this audit, the Australian Centre for Evaluation actually developed a guide for economic evaluations, which have a lot of those that information that's also in the Magenta book reflected. However, it also has slightly different approaches, like a multi-criteria analysis instead of the rubric-based approach. So use them together. But the reason why I'm throwing that in there is that there's a need to really be clear as in terms of what is needed and how you can do value for money assessments in these innovative contexts, and specifically in the context of pilots. The challenge often is that there's not enough evidence there to make long-term economic returns calculations with confidence. And that's, again, linking it back to complex policy context. That's especially difficult to make those calculations. So because we probably won't see any outcomes for a very long time. So, but we do know that governments do still need to make a decision about future investments. And personally, I think that's where, Alex and Julian's approach about value for investments really kind of speaks to it, because it does allow for a multifaceted analysis and to pivot in terms of what is available and use that to make assessments to the extent as possible. But I might throw it over to Alex and Julian to potentially add on to that.
I'll speak briefly and then I'll let Julian come in. So I think one of when you're thinking about a pilot or a program or a test program, one of the objectives is not just delivering what the pilot's trying to do, but it's generating the learning which informs whatever you're going to do next. So often under more sort of traditional VFM approaches, you'll probably focus just on the VFM of what's been paid for and delivered. And it's hot, and you'll probably speculate about the learning value. But what we can do actually, and what we have done, is be explicit about what our learning objectives might be. So I think that's a really interesting approach that I think can be applied to pilots. Julian, I don't know if you want to come in there. We've got some great examples, I think, of where that was put in practice in the real world.
Thanks, Alex. I think you've both covered it very, very well already, but just to add that an ongoing area of development for value for investment is whether and how we might combine it with Michael Quinn-Patton's developmental evaluation so that it actually becomes an integral part of the innovation itself. making stepwise decisions with limited resources about what is the best value for money from the next step. This is something that there aren't really any examples of this in practice. It's a nascent idea that we're working with. And something else I just put in the chat, but I think I'm only able to put it in the chat that's visible to the host and panelists. So if you want to share it more widely, just lift it and send it further. But it's an example from the UK from a group called ELRA, who have developed a VFI-informed value for money framework in the innovation space around humanitarian innovations. And they've done a really nice job of developing some criteria and standards that help them to decide what is worth investing in out of a huge variety of promising proposals that too many to be able to fund all of them, to be able to make some meaningful innovations in the humanitarian space. And yeah, as I say, really nice job of that guide.
Yeah, excellent. Well, why don't we start on some more of the questions that have come through in the chat? So thank you, Elizabeth, for already answering one of them. We have another one here around benefits monetization approaches. What methods have panelists used or would consider using to assign monetary values to non-market outcomes? I feel like we've touched on this a bit, such as well-being, mental health improvements, social connectedness, or life satisfaction. And what are the strengths and limitations of these proxies? What are our thoughts?
So yeah, there's quite a number of evaluations that we're doing in the UK where the key outcomes relate to those types of outcomes. We've done evaluations with looking at young people leaving the care system, and part of that is obviously improving their. Part of the impacts there is about improving their kind of material well-being, but there's a which can be measured in terms of employment and whether they've got housing. But we're very interested often in that kind of overarching well-being, and so that very often requires bespoke surveys. We need to speak to the people, the recipients of these programs, measure that, and there are standardized approaches. There's different academic research has developed different approaches that we then integrate into our surveys, and then we can convert those. Often we work with specialists. This is quite a niche area, so we'll work with specialist economists who we bring in as experts onto our team, and we will work with them to convert those responses into kind of what we call well-bees often. So we often use these well-being, how we can convert self-reported changes in well-being to monetized value. I think that applies to mental health, social connected. Yeah, we use the similar approaches on all of those things. So, but it is a bit of it's quite technical, and it really requires that bringing together of designing great surveys, like bespoke surveys, with the technical knowledge of how you're going to convert that into meaningful monetized values.
Mm-hmm. And Julian's just jumped in the chat. The Green Book also includes guidance for valuation of intangibles too. Yep. Thanks, Julian. Okay, we had another one in here, just scrolling back up again. Thanks, Mike, for your question. Experience in conducting value for money assessments in social and public sector programs from an ex-ante perspective is becoming increasingly important across government entities. Do we have examples of working on strategies, policy programs, or initiatives involving ex-ante BFM, cost-benefit analysis, social return on investment, or other appraisal methods prior to implementation?
I can jump in there if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is really where cost-benefit analysis has probably been used more overall for ex-ante appraisal than for ex-post. It's where it really shines in a lot of cases. But also we've got a few value for investment examples as well of combining both cost-benefit analysis and wider considerations to inform business cases and ex-ante decision making.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've had another question come through that was privately answered, but are there resources available on your website, Julian, with detailed explanations of the method for VFI? And in what way can this be sort of applied to other countries outside of the UK and Australia?
Nice question. Thank you. Yeah, just quickly, yes and yes. So on my homepage, julianking.co.nz, you will find links directly to some detailed guidance that Alex and I and other colleagues have written together. So you can jump straight through to those links and it's all there. I'm writing a book at the moment. It'll be next year probably before it hits the bookshelves, but that will have more detail. And I counted up the other day over 72 countries where value for investment has been recently or is currently being used. So yes, definitely beyond Australia and the UK.
Excellent. All right. We don't have that many more or any more questions in the chat. Does anyone have any final questions in the dying minutes of our webinar? Otherwise, I'll throw to the panel for any sort of final thoughts on this topic. See if anyone's frantically typing. No, nothing's coming through.
I don't know if James can speak. I mentioned James previously. He answered a question on strengths and limitations of each VFM method. There was a question there. James, can you? I don't know if he's got access to a mic, but if not, James has answered that there's in the methods annex in the Magenta book. There's kind of a table, I think it is, or it's set out very clearly the strengths and limitations of the different methods. And crucially, what I think is really helpful is there's examples against those, so you can actually follow through the references and look at the examples that are there.
Excellent.
Thanks, James.
All right. We might wrap it up then. Couple of minutes early, better than being late. Thank you so much to the panel, Alex, Julian, Elizabeth, and for everyone giving up a chunk of their afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, to listen to us talking about evaluating value for money in public services. So that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone. If you have comments, questions after the webinar, I'm sure we'll be emailing you and you can certainly ask additional questions later on. Thank you so much, everyone.